Just about it. Tananarive is an award-winning author who teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA, which is a long trip. She is an executive producer of Shudder's groundbreaking documentary, Horror War, a history of Black horror, a leading voice in Black speculative fiction for more than 20 years. Du has won an American Book Award, an NAACP Image Award, and a British Fantasy Award, and her writing has been included in the Best of the Year anthologies. Her books include Ghost Summer Stories, My Soul to Keep, and The Good House. She and her late mother, civil rights activist Patricia Stevens co-authored Freedom in the Family, a mother-and-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights. She is married to author Stephen Barnes, with whom she collaborates on screenplays. They live with their son, Jason, and 2 cats. Cats that have names addressed.
I mean, Django and Ginger.
Okay, so let's get started. Not just the cheese. Yeah. So a couple years last year we had a panel on Afrofuturism. It was amazing. The year before that we had a panel on Solarpunk, and it was a surprise that these two things have not gotten enough attention together at the same time. And what better place than here at Readercon? So I don't want to spend too much time explaining all of Afrofuturism, all of Solarpunk. What I thought we'd do is have Tananarive to give us a place to focus our attention for Afrofuturism, and for Michael to give us a place to focus for Solarpunk. And then for Cadwell to kind of see where she, where we can find some kind of convergence, where you find an interesting convergence of the two. Okay, we'll start with it. And I'm timing too, so same
okay. Point. Well, how long do I have?
Your time started 5 minutes ago.
So hello everybody, wow, this is a really well-attended panel. I'm so excited about the interest in this topic, which is a somewhat unusual blending, but I love it. Afrofuturism, if you're sitting out there and you don't know what it is, you're not alone. A lot of people don't know what it is. Even people who are practitioners of Afrofuturism often do not self-identify that way. One of the best known ones would have been Octavia Butler, and I doubt very seriously that she ever called herself an Afrofuturist. So when Mark Derry, who's a cultural critic, coined this term back in 1993, he was basically looking at a phenomenon that was underway. Okay, and it was underway in literature, it was underway in music, it was underway in film, in listservs and chat rooms, and he gave it this term Afrofuturism, which Tasha Womack, who's written a book called Afrofuturism, if you're that interested in it, that you want to read a whole book about it, calls it an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation.
I have this.
Right? Oh, you?
In my hotel.
I have it on my Kindle as well in my room. I use a very broad definition of Afrofuturism when I teach at UCLA. It really would be more aptly called Black speculative arts, and there's something called the Black speculative arts movement, which prefers that term, which is, in a nutshell, the science fiction, fantasy, and horror in literature and film of the African diaspora is the way I describe it. I have taught Cadwell Turnbull's work in my Afrofuturism class. I have taught Nydia Okorafor, although she is distinguishing herself as an African futurist, which is fair, you know, because that's a very specific term that she has coined and is a proponent of. But I use this huge umbrella, and the music part comes into play with, let's say, Sun Ra, the late jazz artist, way back in the day. To the present, I would say Janelle Monae is a great example of an Afrofuturist, but it can include everyone from Miles Davis to George Clinton. These are innovators, sometimes but not often, using technology specifically, such as in Sun Ra, Herbie Hancock. Remember Rocket back in the day? Like, when was the last time you heard an instrumental song on the radio? Pop charts.
What's a radio?
Yeah, exactly. What am I talking about? So Afrofuturism is a super, super huge umbrella term, and sometimes people do focus on that word futurism, but just to be specific about it. When I talk about Afrofuturism, I mean everything from magic to magical realism to alternate history. And the one thing that a lot of Afrofuturist so-called artists have in common is that we're really just trying to be visible in spaces where we have been invisible. So whether it's alternate history art, which is basically saying we were here, and this is what we might have done, to futurism, which is even more radical, to say we will be here, and this is what we will do. All of it is in conversation with things that are happening in the present. And I've noticed that a lot of my students have a social activist bent. And I was at a conference in Florida where Angela Davis was present and was talking about Afrofuturism. Well, because I asked her about it. She wasn't speaking about it spontaneously. But she did say that, and I'm going to paraphrase her very badly, but my mother was also an activist. My late mother, I co-authored my book with. And toward the end of her life, my father was just reminding me, she inscribed a book where she felt like they had failed. That civil rights generation, we have failed. And it's not so much that they have failed, it's that it takes more time than one lifetime. And what Angela Davis was speaking to was how do you keep your center? How do you keep your optimism when you are in activist spaces, when change is so very, very difficult? And her basic thing was that it's not gonna happen in your lifetime, but you have to believe in it to work toward it. And I think that in an artistic way, that is what all of these artists, independently, students will ask me, well, was Miles Davis, talking to Octavia Butler, or maybe get the years right, but and they weren't in conversation literally, a lot of these artists, but they were in conversation with their work. Breaking boundaries, when Miles Davis creates, fusion jazz, when Sun Ra uses technology in his music and the synthesizers and Herbie Hancock. When Janelle Monae, very specifically inspired by Sun Ra, uses Afrofuturistic imagery in her music videos. Dirty Computer has a bunch of technology, and a lot of it, as you might imagine, is about the fight for liberation. It's not always oppositional in terms of race, but a lot of these artists are looking, even John Sayles, this brother from another planet. Obviously, he's a white director, but he used his MacArthur grant to fund his movie, The Brother from Another Planet, because he wanted to make a statement about race, about slavery, about community engagement, about community building, etc. So all of these artists, Black and otherwise, are engaged in conversations that, in my view, are trying to create a better world in one way or another.
I think that's kind of where the Solarpunk kind of
Yes, thank you. What a great segue.
I'm not going to be able to, I don't think I want to say as much about Solarpunk as you just said about Afrofuturism, because I feel like I'm here to learn and then take what I learned into editing and publishing and encouraging.
Who here actually really knows what Solarpunk is? Okay, so you have
But I will. It's easy. Okay, so Solarpunk, as I understand it, I am a bit peripheral to the center of the movement, but it originated as a reaction to steampunk, particularly the visual aspects of steampunk. There was a Tumblr, obviously before the implosion of Tumblr, that was the focal point for it, and it was, instead of putting gears on our outfits, we're going to put solar panels. And that, not merely aesthetic, was a statement about how steampunk is quite retro, is thinking about it sort of like polishing up a pretty dirty time in human history where technology was not used to such great purposes. And Solarpunk is looking forward and saying, well, let's not fetishize coal power anymore. We've got this technology that has great potential to not be fossil fuels, so let's clean. And I am trying really hard to get Solarpunk to expand from that. I've squirmed at the term for a long time because I wanted to, wind power is good too, and I'm also a fan of neglected technologies, like indigenous farming technologies, like stuff that's been ignored because it's not dominant capitalist-driven technology developed by Tesla or Edison, you know. So that's why I'm here. I want to expand the goals of Solarpunk, which is to look hopefully into the future and make something that isn't collapse-centered.
Yeah, and I like what you said, what you're saying about it going beyond simply the solar panels. Although I think you kind of stuck with the idea with the word solarpunk. And honestly, it is a bright and hopeful kind of name, solarpunk. So whatever inside of it, I think will also work quite well. So people understand it's not just solar. So for Cadwell, what things or what elements you kind of pull together and what you think really kind of gets your interest?
Right. So I just started publishing, and recently people have been asking me this question about Afrofuturism and Solarpunk, and I've been through dialogue with other people coming up with what I think I'm trying to do that fits into that niche. So there was a story that I was commissioned to write for the Readercon Better World series, and
Can you tell people what that is?
So it's you guys familiar with the Verge magazine? It's like a science magazine online mostly. And they were testing out a project where they would do like short story anthology called Hopeful Futurist, because we need that right now, right? And I decided I wanted to write about St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands in the future. I grew up in the Virgin Islands, and I wrote a story that imagined the Virgin Islands in 2048, and it was ravaged by climate change. There were intense Category 5 hurricanes on regular during the hurricane season, and the people of this community had to come up with ways to cope with this change. And so they had a lot of cooperatives, worker-owned businesses. They also had a cooperative AI that they used to help them take stock of resources that they needed, what resources that they had, and also help in relief efforts after storms. So telling first responders where people were hurt or harmed, also telling people where resources were needed, food, that sort of thing. And a lot of the community members would build community centers with doctors and nurses on staff to help in case of situations that will arise after a hurricane. But also solar and wind power, using that microgrids that could be disassembled after or before storms. All kinds of things I was playing with and thinking about to imagine a positive future where people would come together and use technology to help themselves in crisis.
So again, what you're bringing up is that idea of hope and having kind of science which is very, very human-centered. You know, even the AI there is meant to be, it's not the evil AI that's going to come over and take over the world. It's the one that's going to be in our own best image, right? And how you get there, how that AI interact with the people.
Right. Owned and governed by the people.
Yes. So on that note, I want to kind of tell you guys what we're going to try and do for the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes. Solarpunk and Afrofuturist is huge. So I thought instead of trying to catch everything, we'd look at 3 different regions, right? West Africa, the Caribbean, and then the East Coast of the United States, and kind of stories that we can come up with from there. So we're going to try and do these in 10 minutes, 10-minute sections, and hopefully have 10 minutes at the end for questions. I will keep note of time. If we start to slow down to one of the next thing, I don't think we will. If you have a preference, first, Caribbean, East Coast, Africa. Okay, I'm going to go to Africa. Okay, so raise your hand if you've heard of the Green Wall. So if you haven't, immediately go and Google it. We're not here. So there is, right below the Sahara, there is this kind of, there's another area, I believe it's called the Sahel. Yeah. And it is degraded land, has been for many years. It's the edge of desertification, the southern end of the Sahara. What these countries that are in that area, starting in West Africa and Senegal, decided to do is to build a an amazing, astounding, honestly, kind of a human-built effort. It's a wall, a forest, basically, that goes from west coast to the east coast of Africa. About 8,000 kilometers, about 15 kilometers wide as well. And they started doing this already. They started in Senegal and in Burkina Faso. And they're about 13% of the way there. But in that 13%, millions of trees were planted. You were starting to see a return of biodiversity. You're starting to see governments that had been at each other's throats now working together for this thing which literally goes across borders. You're starting to see a new economy based off of this thing. There are endangered animals which are coming back to a place really where they weren't before, and now there's a place for them here. So I kind of want to talk about that and also the idea of scale, because when I think about solarpunk, oftentimes I think about small communities, right? People working together in something that is not, the punk aspect of it often comes from you not being with the national government because they may be doing something which is too big or too aggressive or not to your people's particular needs. So I wonder what kind of stories, what kind of conflicts you can see in a situation like this where you have cross-border interaction between NGOs, national governments, and then even within a particular country, you'll have at least two, 3 different language groups or more, and there's always one that's dominant there too. So I want to we can see where the conflicts are and come up with possible solutions. I can do this story. It's like kind of like picking it. One of the things I think about is water scarcity, right? So if you are building this, right, you have to get your water from somewhere to start this process. So where is that coming from? Whose water is it? It's across borders.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not in the Caribbean, but
Yeah.
well, I mean, it's coast. So like desalination plants, that's an option, though they're expensive and hard to manage. But I can imagine those things would be, if we're imagining a future, technology geared towards that on a large scale. Also, what? Go ahead.
No, you go. No,
I was going to say, if you're bringing back forests to a region, then you're also bringing back rain, and so that would also be an option ways of capturing rain, irrigation, that sort of thing.
I'm going to approach this question more sort of from the artist's philosophy of how you enact change, right, in the world through works. You mentioned hopeful science fiction. It's interesting because not a lot of the science fiction that editors are calling for now is hopeful. There's a lot of dystopia because we feel that we're in dystopia. And Octavia Butler, part of the reason that made her so fantastic as an artist was her ability to sort of envision this nightmare scenario for us, whether it's one of our world, like in Dawn, where it's aliens, or Parable of the Sower, which is near future and feels like the day after tomorrow, all with this drumbeat to say, if we don't change, this is what's going to happen. Her whole religion is focused on change, so it's not very subtle. We have to change. And in terms of Africa, not West Africa, but in East Africa, the Kenyan filmmaker Wanuri Kahiu jumps out to me because before Black Panther, which was sort of this pan-African, very corporate, of course, look at creating Afrofuturism, not one region of Africa, not actually originating in Africa, but still imagining Africa, imagining the technology, imagining a Wakanda where resources aren't scarce, etc. What Wanuri Kahiu did before Black Panther in her short film, Pumzi, which is P-U-M-Z-I, readily available online, was talk about a society that has scarcity of water. They had to recycle their urine even. That's how scarce liquid water was. And it's about a character who basically sacrifices herself for the good of her community because she, in my mind, she kind of represents the artist. They take dream suppressants in the society and she's not taking her dream suppressants. And art is the act of dreaming, right? And through dreaming, we try to create change, which is why science fiction writers get invited to do what you did, or get invited to take part in, back when we had a science-oriented White House, take part in scientific conferences about imagining the future future and actually, trying to bridge the gap between fiction and reality. And I think that that's what artists like Ulrika are doing. I think that's what Nydia Okorafor, who's Nigerian American, does in much of her work, is sort of envisioning a future Africa, envisioning future possibilities, but often with warnings, because it's so hard to move people from non-movement. It's so hard to get people to stand up and do anything that's different than what we usually do. And sometimes you have to be alarmist to do that. And I think that's why we have a dystopian bent to a lot of this work.
There's so much, I don't know what I'm gonna say about this because I have so much, but okay, so just the hope versus dystopian thing, like, I started reckoning wanting hopeful because I was seeing dystopian. There's a place for dystopian, and I absolutely love Octavia Butler and wish she was still alive, so I put out a call and keep putting out the call, and every issue of this I put out gets darker because the world gets darker, and I can't argue with it. It's in what's in people's collective imagination, and there's no turning that around. However, along that same line, what you were saying about science fiction, like, it is a unique strength of science fiction that it can show us a beautiful, hopeful thing to think about in a sandbox. It doesn't necessarily have to come from dystopian reality. It is open. And this is a unique power of story in general, is to give people ideas. I think, like, flawed and complicated as Black Panther's, like, what the surroundings are, like, it is a huge global blockbuster, and it's doing that own voices thing that is so valuable, because if you tell someone that they can tell their story and that other people will listen to it, they will tell their story, and that story will be in the world now, and that's what story is good for, showing people what's possible. So this is my soapbox with Reckoning, is tell stories, let's find hopeful stories, let's share them with each other, and sort of build a positive echo chamber where we all start thinking towards something, and maybe that thing will become real eventually.
On that end of it, again, going back to the hopeful, and in particular in this part of the world, when people study democracy, they study liberal democracies, oftentimes they're talking about America and the Americas, but right now you will not find a more diverse and active place where they're experimenting with democracy with varying effects and effectiveness is in Africa, different countries in Africa. And so in a place of flux like this, you're bound to find places of conflict, and just in talking about short stories, a place where you can find that kind of hope. Because in the same 50-year span, you will find someone, a friend of a friend, who was a child soldier, right? Still alive at the time right now, where they're now building this green wall, right? So just that person, a piece of that person's life will have a huge impact, I think, on anybody trying to get an understanding, a better understanding of the kind of stories that can happen. When we say Africa is a dark continent. Well, Africa is a dark continent, and they're able to do all of this. Everybody can do all of this, and just finding that right kind of story. But one of the things about Afrofuturism, I want to talk to kind of see if it emerges from Solarpunk, is that in Afrofuturism stories, there is room for magic. There are, I want to make sure I pronounce it correctly, the Dagara, or Dagara, I think it's pronounced Dagara. They are a community in Western Africa who have been studied, I think, more than some others, and in their management system isn't the right word, their outlook on the world, which does not have a word for science fiction. It's really what we think is science fiction, they're just expanding on their terms of what is possible, right? And that includes things like time travel. That includes things like telepathy. So is there room for that kind of belief system in a Solarpunk story?
I hope so.
Or rather, where do we make that? What kind of terrible things you would say to make that, help us make that transition?
In bridging Afrofuturism and Solarpunk,
Yes.
you mean?
the magic in Afrofuturism.
This is not what I came on this panel to do. I came here to be quiet and listen, but I will.
But you're the solarpunk.
Yeah. So we'll give you the Afrofuture. You can just
I mean, the character that compels me to do what you're describing is an individual power. This concept is awesome. I love the concept of what's possible. So I'm following this guy on Twitter whose name I have written down here, and I'm going to call him Emmanuel Emilio de Cruz. He's in Burundi, and he is like his entire Twitter is pictures of millions of water bottles, like disposable water bottles, that he has collected, and he's filling them with trees to plant to make this green wall. And like this guy followed me out of the blue, and he's constantly adding me. I don't know why, but he's like super inspirational to me. And he's not going to write a story about what he's doing. He's doing what he's doing. But I want someone to write a story about someone like him, because that is precious and little. That's giving me hope in the world. And that
what is his job? His job is
I don't know. He's just a guy. He's 20. He's 20 years old, and he's like, I'm going to plant 1 million trees. And yeah.
Actually, one of the good points about the green wall is that the majority of the people who are working on it, besides people who are organizing, there's government agencies and tons of NGOs working together. A lot of them are volunteers. They just come. They see this as an important thing. They just come. So, before I'm able to answer this particular question, what else want to add to this conversation about a non-Western tradition hero, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, all change is an act of magic, right? So what I love, and I love that this is a 20-year-old. My mother was 20 when she was arrested for the first time. And there's just something about that age where they look at the world and they're like, well, why is it like this? And we're like, oh, well, we have all these reasons. And they're like, you know. That's not, we're going to change that. We're going to fix that. So, yeah, whether it's time travel, telepathy, a character, generally this kind of protagonist, this is like a story prompt, you know,
Yep.
would be like confronted with a reality that seems intractable to elders. And with that, I like to write young narrators very often for this reason, because they don't let themselves be stopped by tradition or what they expect the world to be, and enable others to see what they see. That's the thing, is communicating the vision to others, because one person planting a tree is only going to get you so far. Even one person planting 100 trees will only get you so far. So you have to communicate this passion and help others see what you see. And that is the stuff of the story, is getting people to see.
Well, one thing that comes to mind when you say that is one of the things that's really difficult, what's necessary, is technology transfer, right? So if you have the expertise, how do you get that out to the right people at the right time, and then make it not so advanced or not so process oriented, where it takes a lot of people to do this one thing, but together actually you can have people. Anyway, the point being, you get information right hands to the right people. I can see a story where you have someone of that age, 20, right, and they've gone to school, right? They have done the Western education. They understand though that what they go back and tell their family and their friends, they have to give them another PhD. You don't want them to have another PhD. There's already a language. There's already a system of belief. If you just talk to do that system of belief, you might have change happen more quickly. Now, whether that is through a shamanistic belief or whatever, I don't know. I guess that would be more specific to the story where they're coming from. If we had time, I'll tell you about a funny story at the end. My wife's family's from Burkina Faso, and her father's best friend is a rainbow musician. So. Okay, so I want to, unless we have something else we want to add here, I want to move on to another region. Okay. Caribbean, or do you want to go East Coast?
The Caribbean.
All right. Okay, so turn the notes. So the Caribbean, like we already talked about, and honestly, even the East Coast United States, while some parts of the NA will be impacted by climate change much more quickly than other places. And so particularly quickly because they're majority islands. And you know what islands do, they break apart, they fall apart, and then people sink. Islands just literally disappear. So there are questions about what can you do in a community? Let's say, let's imagine it's not Jamaica, but it's Jamaica-like, right? Where the majority of the industry there is either agricultural or it's tourism, right? So both of those require people. They need people to be constantly coming to this area. So what kind of technologies might be used to sustain life, to make it more resilient to a hurricane, or even if that's possible, when you heck go somewhere else.
Okay, so I'll talk about my book, but I'll also talk about the short story I mentioned. Part of thinking about technology is not just thinking about physical things, but also social things. How can you create organization that will help people be more tenacious in crisis? And so having organizations that are more consensus-based, that are distributed power, non-hierarchical, cooperative, is one way that you create strength in a community. Having the community take ownership and have ownership of their resources, their businesses, their technologies. And so like in the story that I wrote, I had the community members have cooperatively owned businesses. They owned their businesses, and they took the money that they were getting from tourism to help fortify the island. So they changed the architecture.
When you say fortified, what do you mean?
So changing the architecture of the buildings, like creating dome buildings to be more resistant to wind, anchoring the buildings into the ground, state-of-the-art shutters, like I said, microgrids, but microgrids that can be removed and enclosed during a hurricane and then removed back out again, that sort of thing.
So I don't know much about microgrids, so
okay.
between the two of you, maybe you can.
It's kind of the way that I would talk about it is like Tetris, like taking a bunch of different pieces and then putting it together and then taking them apart.
Oh.
So like having a block that powers themselves, but also is in a grid that powers the rest of the island. And so those are the things that you would think about if you're living on an island where you're being threatened every year with a hurricane. You try to figure out ways that you can preserve. Because I mean, right now in St. Thomas, in the Virgin Islands generally, we have regular like electric lines, and they get blown down all the time. Sure. And they'll stay there for years sometimes. They'll just get blown down like telephone pole or pulled down like electric wire, just hanging out. So like thinking about burying those things or other forms of power is one option. So I'm going to talk about my book.
If you mind.
If you must.
Mention the title.
Turn towards the camera.
Right. There's this technology in the book called reefs that are intelligent cells that the aliens in the book use to not only take care of their bodies but also build superstructures. And so imagining a future where, without getting into spoilers for the book, where the Caribbean has access to that kind of technology, what they would be able to do with it, how they would be able to protect themselves from hurricanes, is something that I personally get excited about. I'll stop talking.
Okay, well, at this point I have a beginning of time. No, it's necessarily yours. Okay. So at this point I often have a question about the underlying governance, a situation like that. So coming together action, right? So community-based where there was consensus, but I've run large organizations before. Consensus is a pain in the ass. It's like getting 100 cats to type the piano and do Shakespeare in the park all the same time. That's an overstatement, but it was fun. And so there's that versus having a top-down system where you say, you know what, we're all going to do this, and it gets done.
Right.
So I can see a conflict there.
Top-down doesn't always work that way either, though, right? And okay, so in solidarity economics is this idea of federation. So like
Solidarity economics.
Yeah, like using economics to help the whole, the group, instead of the singular person. So co-ops are an example of that. But there's also this idea of federation, where you take something small and you create like a chain of connection. So like having a community consensus structure, and then having someone from that group as a representative that goes to a larger community structure, and they form consensus, and then having those communities form like a chain of community consensus. So, and it doesn't always have to be consensus. Consensus is one way of having decisions, but also like supermajorities, or having some sort of deliberation where most people are happy, consent. So like most people are, I can live with that, I think is an approach to think about. It doesn't always have to be everyone's happy about everything.
And being okay with not getting that.
Right, and being okay with not getting that.
Disaster is a great builder of consensus.
Right.
If you look at what happened in Puerto Rico, you know, the power company could not fix everybody's power for a variety of reasons, and many of them involving evil capitalists, and people
Disaster
went out and built
capitalism.
little bits of microgrid for themselves, solar panels, that kind of thing. Like,
Right.
if you need something badly enough, you will, I think, I gather, I have not experienced disaster myself, but listening to that Rebecca Solnit book,
Paradise Built in Hell.
yeah, it's sort of all about that, how people who've experienced disaster come together a lot better than people who have all there.
Yeah, you gotta take something away from them if you want to make a move.
Yeah, which is why, you know, unfortunately, crisis does beget innovation. And I think, you know, the more comfortable the society is, or the more comfortable more members of the society are, I think we're seeing, the less likely you are to see innovation in those ways. And then the people who really have their backs to the wall have to figure it out, you know? So yeah, I think that we can expect to see a lot of leadership from Africa and from the Caribbean in these kinds of conversations, because we can get devastated. When we get devastated by a hurricane, it's like one city or, you know, a small region of a country that the rest of the country ignores, and we can pretend those wildfires aren't burning in California, you know, but when it's your entire nation that is threatened by a hurricane, that's an entirely different matter.
And also being overlooked by
Yeah.
by the larger world forces you to have to take care of yourself and figure out ways to live in the midst of crisis. So like, you know, just thinking about Hurricane Irma and Maria, and how the U.S. responded to what happened in Puerto Rico, what happened in St. Thomas and St. John, and how, you know, oftentimes, you know, these communities have had to figure out ways to cope and survive.
And even, you know, if you're watching the news here in New York City, 1,000 miles away, looking at Puerto Rico, you will see that larger kind of dystopian narrative. But if you were to tell a smaller story of what's happening there, you will find those places where a solarpunk story would work, where even though they're off the grid, they have figured out some way where they can survive. And they've come up with an idea which wasn't there before, and wasn't given to them by Tesla. And they'll make it work. There's a possibility that this thing will work. And that hope is not a given at the end of the story. This is, for everybody, a fairy tale, but that idea of hope. Although I will say, in the Caribbean, I was doing some research about this before I came in, there are about 20 or 30 different like international organizations that are working in the Caribbean. Besides the UN, there's one that's, I forget the name, I forget what the acronym stands for, but literally the acronym is CC. The Caribbean's there, it's in there somewhere. And there's like, even like German nonprofits are getting involved in disseminating technology. So where there is a need and that's kind of a capital spend is kind of taken out of it, and you start to see different kind of organizations kind of form around a different way of looking at the world. Anything else on the Caribbean before we move on?
I have a Caribbean adjacent example of leapfrogging technology, which is something that sort of makes me hopeful. So my sister lived in Guatemala for a while. I've spent some time pretty much about it. Guatemala is very mountainous and has a lot of poor people. And long before they got phone lines out to most of Guatemala, suddenly cell phones came along and everyone adopted cell phones. And that was it uplifted people gave them the ability to communicate without having to rely on a central source. And I think that happened in Africa as well. And there's potential for solar panels and improving battery technology to provide things like that to remote communities. And maybe there's stuff like that with storm preparedness that we haven't thought of yet, but that seems like a great area of potential thinking for Solarpunk and Afrofuturist.
Yeah, things that are advanced technology, but it's not so cross-offs where you can do it there. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be outsourced and brought into you. One more thing about the Caribbean before I go on to this. This is, I don't know exactly, this idea can go either way, honestly. There is a lot of sand theft in the Caribbean. Places where they're just picking up sand and they're sneaking it out of the country, and they're using it to build areas for resorts. Or they're taking land, taking it to other countries like Singapore. If you look at the map, Singapore is actually bigger than it used to be because they've expanded out by taking land from, I think, Vietnam and other places, and also maybe from the Caribbean too, because they're looking for a very specific sand. However, the technology and the ability to do that, to actually expand the land is there, and that can be used in the opposite direction rather than stealing, gifting the land in the direction. So we have 8 minutes. Okay, well, we're going to come home to the East Coast United States. This is us. This is home. Fuck Trump. Yeah, go on Twitter about it. It's great. So I had a vision. That's not the right word. It's not Sonic in any way. I had an idea. What if there was another great migration? We've had great migration from the south to the north for obvious reasons. And Black people tend to go from the rural to the urban. That's where most of us are now. So what if there was some enlightened Congress and president who decided that we need to move the coastal cities, that population, inland, because seawalls aren't going to get it done in the amount of time that we have. So New York City has to move inland. Boston has to move inland, or at least those populations must go to the place. So in this country, Black people are already a minority. So then now you're talking more about integration. Now you're talking about a New Deal, and you can combine that with a Green New Deal. But this is now a mass scale kind of project idea. But where do you think the conflicts would be as you are now starting to build cities? You are preemptively looking to say, okay, we have this number of people here. How are we going to build a grid? Where are we going? How do we move these communities and do it in a way where it's not just a replication of New York inland, a replication of Boston issues that they had inland as well?
Well, I think people of means would just want to leave, period, which a lot of people already want to do. But if you add on top of that, well, I'm just saying, remember when Black Panther came out, at least in my circles, there were a lot of people packing their bags for Wakanda, is all I'm saying. And they were very sad to hear that it wasn't real. But I think there is kind of this sort of dream of experiencing something that's different in a lot of Black communities and marginalized communities, certainly. Just as a side note, the first move would be like, I don't know if I want to move from New York to Kansas, but I would not mind moving from New York to Wakanda. Is there a Wakanda? What is Wakanda?
Wakanda, Kansas.
Yeah, pretty much. So I am, that's a really scary question. I have no idea what that would look like. It would be chaotic. Yeah.
Looking at how that has played out in history in this country, it has never gone great. I mean, Detroit might be that. I live there now. It's 80% African American because the white people ran away, and they get to have some kind of incredibly resource-poor utopia there. And they're doing great stuff. Urban farming, pioneering, like not being done anywhere else in the world, and people from Germany fly in and they're urban farming, and it's inspiring, but it's also they are incredibly limited, and they're doing it with land that has been contaminated by industrialism, So what that looks like on the East Coast, where someone can do it in a way that works. sometimes these solar punk ideas feel like pipe dreams to me, and I don't know how to reconcile that.
But if you write it first, then you think about the possibility. I mean, I venture this idea because it really is a big, scary idea, and it's been done before, and it hasn't gone particularly well. But we saw in the past, in the past debates, that the people who were the Democrats, our friends who were in power at that time, who were able to make deals to our benefit, talking about Biden, because of to have some kind of deal. And if you were a Democrat, if you were a progressive, even Martin Luther King, you had to make a lot of concessions because those were the people you're dealing with. Let's imagine a United States where the Green New Deal, what's already in front of Congress right now, somebody says yes to that. That's done. We've said yes, we need to do this. Also said we believe in science. Okay, we believe in science. How about urban planning? We believe in that too, but in the right way.
That's a lot of miracles.
Well, the miracle is
Science.
they should start with science.
I know, it should.
But
I mean, really, it's so frustrating. We're in such an important period of world history right now. And to feel like there's this anti-science, anti-intellectualism bent is just maddening. But go on.
Well, no, I guess I want to leave more time to have a conversation with the rest of the group is, as big as that, as tall as that mountain is, you still got to fucking climb it, So the question is, who is that character? Who is the person you put on the page, right? When you do this, what shifts? What has to break? I can imagine, and this is, I guess, somewhat controversial. If you take a New York City precinct, and you move them out of New York City, and you take somewhere else, now what happens? Are they now going to be the same as people who were there, right? Because our New York City precincts, while they are still mostly white, not by a lot. I live in Queens, so I live in East Atlanta. I live in Brooklyn, and so I'm walking through my streets and I see the police officers on the subway. It's Black, Jewish, and Hispanic all hanging out together with their guns, looking at you, giving you the eye. But it looks very different if you're going to say, I don't know why people are going to Kansas. Let me keep up going to Kansas. I don't know. It starts with Campbell, like I said. So if you go there, now it's a new situation. If you do urban planning in a way where you not have the kind of segregation you have in New York State, apparently, according to HBO, New York State schools are more segregated now than ones in the South. So if you have that in mind, that's the problem. When you go to these new communities that we're now building, how do you rectify that?
So as a fiction writer, this is my critique of these fictions. I feel like there's not enough focus on the social, the cultural, and the political reasons why these things exist. Like you can build a new city inland. You could legislate a Green New Deal, but if you're not addressing the cultural and the social aspects, you get what we got when we did integration. You get white flight. You get economic reasons why people justify fleeing, or racial reasons why people will justify not coming together. So if you're not thinking about how do you change hearts and minds of these people in order to help these technological advancements that you're trying to create, or these alternative systems that you're trying to build, then you're not going to get this future that you're imagining. That there needs to be that in conversation stuff, and there needs to be a conversation about ownership. Like, do the communities that are on the front lines of this, do they have ownership of where this is headed, how it will get there, and will they be allowed to maintain that ownership?
Well, that will be the story. That will be the story. And you guys have already said it, what motivates people? A disaster will motivate people. By putting that bomb in the room, that changes people's thinking.
Yeah, I think, and I'll just speak very quickly at the end here. I tell my writing students, whether they're writing futurism or history, no matter what amount of research you do, the one thing that will not disappoint you is human nature, right? So you already know what it's like to be a person in the 1500s because you know what it's like to be a person now. No matter where we go, there we are. And this is what Octavia railed against so much. You know, the things that she railed against were in our nature, the hierarchy. You know, the sense that we put ourselves above other people, or other people put themselves above us. Denial, so big. How do you bring denial out of human nature when denial, I think, is rooted in fear of death? From the time we're kids, we kind of know we're going to die, but we don't want to think about that. So we've learned how to just sort of skate through with a kind of daily denial that enables us to feel joy from time to time. So how do we extract that? You know, take the best parts of us, but extract the worst parts of us, and build these futures that we'd all like to see. That's going to be the hard part. Sorry to be a bummer, but yeah, it's a tough road.
I got a lot to say about that. 2 minutes. So, questions, comments. I prefer questions, to be honest, because that's conversation.
Can you talk more about kids? You know, Malala and the Swedish, that Swiss girl.
Thank goodness for them.
And, you know, isn't that the hope?
Yes.
Yes.
To a degree, except
if we get out of the way, right?
Yeah.
You know, this has been the problem now. There's a lot of people in their 20s and in their 30s that have been advocating for change, and people haven't gotten out of the way and allowed that to happen. So we would have to get out of the way in order for these people that are inheriting our problems and the future to step in and do the work that they need to do, or we need to help them.
On a somewhat related topic, I recommend anyone look up this book. It's a thick book, but it's called The History of Childhood. And one of the things that it talks about is the different kinds of archetypes that are allowed to exist in society, dependent upon what we're allowed to do to children, what level of pain that they're allowed to live in. And every successive year, rather generation where we no longer have to deal with the pressures or the conflicts put upon us by our parents who are dealing with their own issues, right? The easier it is to have a multitude of different archetypes, a multitude of different perspectives, and the freedom to be the kind of people that we're talking about. Now, that comes from basically being in a society where people are more emotionally developed, right? Even us being able to have this conversation at whole, that says something. You know, the kind of things that he's talking about, was talking from where child abuse was just common, wasn't illegal, to, oh wait, you shouldn't throw that baby against the wall, to, oh, this is a different way that you should discipline it. Oh, let's rethink discipline altogether. All right. So when you start getting to a point where the adults who are raising the children aren't as stuck in their own anxieties and personal dilemmas, you're going to start to see differences in the behavior of children, and stop there.
And in terms of organizing, if any of you are organizers, Adrienne Marie Brown's A Version of Strategy. Also, with Octavia and looking at alternatives to top-down leadership, which is also, I think, very hopeful as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
How's it going? Sorry. Sorry, I just have to come over here and push the button. It's okay.